Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Before we begin today's news analysis, I would like to inform you that tomorrow at 11 a.m., Mukesh Jasar shall be holding a workshop for IAS aspirants with regard to the preparation strategy needed for the next attempt. So, those who are interested, please don't forget to register yourselves in the link that would be provided in the description box below. With this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column, written by Dr. Abhay Shukla, a senior public health activist, he makes a case for a renewed healthcare system for India, considering how the pandemic has exposed the weakness in the Indian healthcare system. He primarily focuses on the need to strengthen our public healthcare system, and hence he lays down a roadmap for the new health minister, which could help in fixing the gaps in our healthcare system. Based on his experience during the pandemic, he says that the mantra for India should be very simple, and any attempt to renew the healthcare system should be based on these three steps. First, the government should work towards strengthening the public healthcare system, followed by adequate regulation of private healthcare, along with a cap on further privatization of the healthcare sector in order to give public healthcare a dominant position in the country's healthcare system. Currently, India is said to have one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world, thereby making healthcare very expensive and unaffordable, as the out of pocket expenditure that one incurs on healthcare happens to be very high in India, and as a result, the lower and the weaker sections are deprived of quality healthcare in the country. The public healthcare system, which was supposed to cater to them, is grossly inadequate due to the government's low spending on public healthcare. To justify his argument and to highlight the importance of public healthcare, he takes the example of Maharashtra and Kerala and compares their performance during the pandemic. As you might know, these two states have been registering the highest number of cases over the last several months due to several reasons and factors. While both the states have been equally affected with regard to the incidence of cases, and while both have similar economic capacities, as their per capita state GDP is almost similar, but there exists a major difference with regard to their case fatality rate. In Maharashtra, the fatality rate stands at 2.04%, whereas for Kerala, the case fatality rate is hardly around 0.48%. So, this essentially means that the chances of a COVID 19 patient dying in Maharashtra is nearly 4 times higher than that of Kerala. The writer attributes this huge difference in case fatality rate to the stronger public healthcare institution in Kerala and its effectiveness in containing and in managing the pandemic. The writer points out the relevant data as well to show how the Kerala state government has built a stronger public healthcare model at the grassroots. On a per capita basis, Kerala has nearly 2.5 times more government doctors than Maharashtra. Even with regard to government hospital beds, Kerala has a higher proportion of government beds as compared to Maharashtra. And even if you compare their public healthcare budget, Kerala's healthcare budget is nearly 1.5 times Maharashtra's state healthcare budget. Another stark difference between the healthcare systems of Maharashtra and Kerala is that in Maharashtra, the healthcare system is more privatized as compared to the largely public healthcare driven model of Kerala. So these differences, according to the writer, has proven to be a critical deficiency which has directly contributed to a higher case fatality rate in Maharashtra as compared to Kerala. He points out that even as cases have spread rapidly in Kerala, the largely public healthcare driven model has been quite efficient in reaching out to the patients and in carrying out timely testing, early case detection, and efficient contact tracing. And more importantly, at the grassroots, it has been able to provide affordable health care, thus providing timely intervention for COVID 19 patients, especially from the lower and the weaker sections. So, this stronger foundation of the public healthcare system in Kerala reportedly has contributed to a lower case fatality rate, and hence the writer is calling for further strengthening the public healthcare model across the country. See, this is a lesson we can learn not just from Kerala but from around the world as well. Even in other countries where you have an efficient healthcare system, you will find that it is largely driven by the public healthcare system, that is the government funded healthcare system, and not by the private sector. But India's excessive reliance on private healthcare has not only increased out of pocket expenditure and reduced the quality of healthcare, but it has also led to the neglect of our public healthcare institutions. To further highlight these concerns, the writer refers to the lack of funding to the National Health Mission from the central government, and he points out how a budget of just 1000 crore rupees has been allotted to the National Urban Health Mission. This would amount to just a per capita allocation of 2 rupees per individual in urban areas. So he points out that the lack of government spending on healthcare and the declining expenditure of the center on public healthcare systems has weakened the healthcare safety net in the country, and the pandemic should serve as a lesson to strengthen the healthcare model by investing adequately in our public healthcare institutions. He calls upon the government to follow the recommendations of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Healthcare, which has called for doubling India's healthcare budget in order to strengthen the healthcare services both in the rural and the urban areas. The second concern of the writer is with regard to the lack of regulation of the private healthcare industry. Even though India has one of the most privatized healthcare systems in the world, these private healthcare institutions are inadequately regulated by the government and the regulatory agencies. And this has led to a situation where the private healthcare industry is constantly seen to be overcharging the patients as they are entirely driven by the profit motive. And this has even led to substandard healthcare quality in the private sector. For example, during the pandemic, hospitalization has led people to incur a cost of 1 lakh rupees to 3 lakh rupees per week. And we have also seen the widespread usage of unproven and ineffective treatments, especially the usage of expensive therapies and treatments, such as the usage of remdesivir, the abuse of steroids, which in turn has directly contributed to rising black fungus cases. So these instances just illustrate how the private healthcare industry is largely driven by the profit motive, and it often tends to overcharge the patients. And this even leads them to provide for unnecessary services just in order to bill the patients, thereby reducing the overall quality of healthcare in the private sector. It is highly unfortunate that the private healthcare sector is not adequately regulated, even though we have a legislation for this in place. In 2010, the Clinical Establishments Registration and Regulation Act was enacted by the Parliament, but unfortunately, the central government has enforced and implemented this act in a very poor manner. Till date, the required regulatory framework under the act has not been notified by the center, and the center has not taken necessary steps along with state governments to enforce the provisions of this legislation. In fact, it is the absence of this regulatory framework that led a few state governments during the peak of the pandemic to invoke emergency disaster related provisions under the Epidemic Diseases Act and the Disaster Management Act to cap the prices of therapies and treatments. So the writer says that the second step for improving India's healthcare system would be to effectively regulate the private healthcare sector. And the third and the final step should be to prevent further privatization and instead strengthen our public healthcare institutions. But contrary to this expectation, Niti Aayog has proposed a policy document which pushes for further privatization in the healthcare industry. Recently, the Niti Aayog has published a document titled Investment Opportunities in India's Healthcare Sector. And according to the writer, the wordings in this document is so insensitive that it appears to promote the exploitation of the opportunity created by the pandemic in India. This policy document is seeking more investments in the private healthcare sector, but without any consideration for the social purpose, which should be of utmost importance in healthcare. The document even makes a few controversial proposals, such as handing over public healthcare institutions to private institutions, and such proposed commercialization of public healthcare institutions will go against the social objectives that the healthcare sector is expected to fulfill. So, in this context, the writer calls for a renewed healthcare architecture for India, which could truly fulfill the social objectives of healthcare, along with providing quality and affordable healthcare. And the only way forward, according to him, would be to further strengthen the public healthcare system and parallelly regulate the private healthcare sector and prevent further privatization. Now let's take up an article from page number 1, which brings out the debate between right to religion and right to life. See, in the Indian Constitution, secularism is a basic feature as recognized by the Supreme Court in the S.R. Bommai case of 1994. The Supreme Court has time and again ruled that the Indian Constitution is inherently secular because our Constitution makers included the fundamental right to religion under Article 25 to Article 28, which guarantees individuals the fundamental right and the freedom to freely profess, practice, and propagate their religion, and as well as to manage their religious affairs. It also gives them the freedom with regard to payment of taxes for promotion of any particular religion, and also provides the freedom to attend any religious instruction or religious worship in certain educational institutions. Now, what will happen if these fundamental rights run into conflict with another key fundamental right, such as right to life, which is guaranteed under Article 21 of the Constitution? This question has been answered by the Supreme Court in a case involving the UP government and the popular Kanwar Yatra. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with the Kanwar Yatra, as every year lakhs of devotees and pilgrims from Uttar Pradesh walk all the way to key Hindu pilgrimage sites in Uttarakhand and Bihar to fetch the holy waters of the Ganga river. But holding this annual pilgrimage has become problematic as a result of the pandemic and due to the social distancing measures. We already know what happened earlier this year in Uttarakhand during the Kumbh Mela and how such large-scale religious gatherings can act like a super spreader event during a pandemic. So in this context, the UP government was seeking permission from the Supreme Court to hold a symbolic Kanwar Yatra by arguing that if the Yatra or the pilgrimage is cancelled entirely, then it will compromise the fundamental rights of the citizens with regard to their right to religion, and it tried to make a case for the conduct of a symbolic Kanwar Yatra by citing compelling religious reasons. But the Supreme Court, in a landmark observation, has dismissed this argument of the UP government, and it has clearly ordered that even a symbolic Kanwar Yatra cannot be held during the pandemic. That's because the fundamental right to religion is secondary and subservient to one of the most important fundamental rights in the Constitution, that is, right to life under Article 21. The Supreme Court has clearly said that Article 21 occupies the pride of place in the Indian Constitution and within the chapter on fundamental rights. And through various interpretations, the Supreme Court has said right to health is an integral part of right to life under Article 21. So that being the case, any activity, even a religious activity, that threatens the health of the citizens can be prohibited on the grounds of Article 21. And in such cases, you cannot claim that your fundamental right to religion has been compromised, because right to religion has always been subservient and secondary to right to life under Article 21. Because please remember that these fundamental rights to religion, they are not absolute in the Indian Constitution. They come with a set of reasonable restrictions, and the fundamental right to religion can be curbed by the state on the grounds of public order, morality, health, and other provisions. So the Constitution explicitly states health as one of the reasonable restrictions, and on this basis, the Supreme Court has ruled that no physical yatra can be permitted this year, not even a symbolic yatra, because during a pandemic, such mass congregations can compromise right to health under Article 21, which is integral to right to life, and on this account, right to religion can be curbed and curtailed. Now let's take up a couple of related articles from page number 1 and page number 8. According to this article, the Supreme Court has taken note of the delay in implementing bail orders by the jail authorities. See, seeking and obtaining bail is one of the basic rights that has been accorded to the accused. It is seen as an integral part of the liberty and dignity of the prisoners, and wherever feasible, as per the provisions of the law, the courts can grant relief to the prisoners by providing them bail. But shockingly, it has been noticed that there is a huge delay in implementing the bail orders because in most cases, the jail authorities they insist on receiving the hard copies of the judgment of the court, thereby resulting in long delays, which ends up compromising the liberty and the dignity of the prisoner, even though he or she has been awarded a bail by the court. So, taking note of this shocking development, the Chief Justice of India has observed that in today's age of information and communication technology, we can't afford to be stuck in an outdated world. And hence, in order to instantly transfer the court orders to all the concerned authorities, the Supreme Court has announced a major initiative known as FASTER, which stands for Fast and Secure Transmission of Electronic Records. Through this initiative, the Supreme Court intends to instantly transmit its orders, including bail orders, to all the concerned stakeholders, including jail authorities, district courts, high courts, and the concerned governments. For rolling out this ambitious scheme, the Supreme Court has directed the Secretary General of the Supreme Court to come out with a comprehensive report within 2 weeks to make this plan workable. And once it is up and running, the Supreme Court will be directly transmitting the orders almost instantaneously to all the concerned authorities to ensure that there are no delays or lags in implementation of the court orders. Next, in this article, it has been reported that the Supreme Court has taken a few more measures to decongest our overcrowded prisons considering the pandemic situation. The Indian prisons, which fall under the jurisdiction of the state governments, are known for their poor conditions as most of the prisons lack basic facilities and they are often overcrowded. India's prison population stands at more than 4 lakh and many of them are under trials, thereby raising questions of their liberty and dignity being compromised as they continue to languish in these overcrowded prisons. So, in the interest of protecting the prison population and in the interest of enforcing social distancing norms, the Supreme Court took an initiative last year itself and directed NALSA, or the National Legal Services Authority, to work with state governments to set up high powered committees which could screen the prison population and grant interim bail to minor offenders and to those who are facing minor charges. So, accordingly, several thousand prisoners were released from across the country. And now the Supreme Court has directed the jail authorities and the state governments to not seek their immediate surrender as the pandemic has not yet come to an end. And it has directed the authorities to continue focusing on decongesting the prisons. In this regard, the Supreme Court had even ordered the state police to limit their arrests, and even magistrates had been urged by the Supreme Court to limit their detention orders, especially in case of minor offences involving a punishment of less than 7 years in jail. Now let's take up an article from page number 9. The Chief of the Indian Navy has raised the important topic of building underwater domain awareness as a part of India's maritime security strategy. See, as far as maritime security is concerned, the traditional security concept calls for establishment of maritime domain awareness. Under this concept, the naval force and the security forces, they try to understand the various threats that they are dealing with in their respective areas of interest in the maritime domain. And they also try to develop a deep understanding of the terrain and geography of the region so that they will not just be able to better comprehend the maritime threats, but they will also be able to better strategize their own options, including the deployment of their maritime naval assets. Such enhanced maritime domain awareness is needed when you are looking to defend the exclusive economic zone of the country and when you are looking to protect the strategic sea lanes of communication along with coastal waters, maritime assets, and as well as coastal assets, which could be both civilian and military installations. Maritime domain awareness is absolutely essential, not just for defending the country's EEZ and the waters beyond it, but also to protect the important lanes of communication, which is vital for global trade. And such maritime domain awareness will also help the naval forces and the security forces to protect the country's coastal areas along with its maritime and coastal assets. So, under this concept of maritime domain awareness, we have a specialized branch known as underwater domain awareness. This branch of maritime domain awareness has been gaining a lot of popularity of late due to rapid advances that have been made in the field of underwater defense technology. Hence, underwater domain awareness becomes very important, especially considering the rapid progress that countries like US and China have made with regard to the development of unmanned autonomous vehicles and weapons. See, traditionally, the underwater threats included enemy submarines and as well as a range of underwater electronic sensors, which were designed to carry out surveillance and collect intelligence against enemy positions. The traditional underwater threat also included the mines that would be laid out as a line of defense against enemy vessels. But today, there are new and hybrid threats that are emerging underwater due to the rapid advancement that has been made in underwater defense technology. Today, it is possible to deploy unmanned autonomous vehicles and weapons which can function independently and they can even be controlled remotely. And these underwater vehicles and weapons can even be driven by artificial intelligence. Now imagine a regular submarine which can be turned into a mother submarine to act as an underwater aircraft carrier. Today, through underwater defense technology, it is possible to convert a regular manned submarine into a mother submarine of sorts, which could unleash a swarm of underwater drones. And these underwater drones, which can be operated remotely or which can be driven by artificial intelligence, they could operate in coordination and they could carry out major strikes against any maritime or coastal assets. Or they could be deployed on underwater missions to collect intelligence and to carry out surveillance. So countries like US and China have already made rapid advances in this field and they have even deployed entire squadrons of unmanned autonomous underwater vehicles. The threat posed by this technology is very real for India because recently, near the coast of Indonesia, that is in a key part of the Indian Ocean region, the Indian Navy had detected the presence of autonomous underwater gliders which were reportedly of Chinese origin. So, in this light, the Chief of the Indian Navy has highlighted the threat posed by underwater vehicles and weapons, and he has called upon the Indian defense establishment to scale up India's progress with regard to underwater defense technology in order to further enhance our underwater domain awareness. In this regard, civilian institutions like the National Institute of Oceanography, they've developed an autonomous vehicle known as Maya, and this autonomous underwater vehicle is mainly used for civilian purposes, that is to carry out research that is primarily focused on oceanic research. That defense agencies like the DRDO and the Navy's Directorate of Naval Design are also reportedly working on underwater drones and other underwater technologies and weapons. And reportedly, the Marcos or the Marine Commandos, which is a special force of the Indian Navy, already uses a underwater glider to deploy themselves into enemy territory while they are conducting their covert operations. Now let's take up an article from page number 14, which deals with the concept of carbon trading. See, this topic is in news because China has started its much awaited scheme known as the carbon trading scheme. China has launched this ambitious initiative in order to achieve carbon neutrality, that is to match its greenhouse gas emissions with emission reduction initiatives by 2060. See, this concept of carbon trading goes back to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol of the Climate Change Convention. Before the Paris Agreement that we have currently, which is the primary accord on climate change, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol had been worked out in 1997, which was the primary climate change agreement. Under this, the concept of carbon trading and emission trading was introduced as a way of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. This concept essentially refers to the trading of emissions. It is about offsetting your emissions by purchasing the right to pollute from others who already have a lower carbon footprint. So let's see as to how this was working. See, under the Kyoto Protocol, a clear distinction was made between the developed countries and the developing nations. Under the Kyoto Protocol, developed countries were held responsible for their historical emissions, and hence they were expected to do more in order to tackle the threat of climate change and global warming. So, under the Kyoto Protocol, the developed and developing countries and the least developed countries. They were classified into different categories and they were given a different set of responsibilities under the doctrine of CBDR, or Common but Differentiated Responsibilities, which was championed by countries like India. This doctrine meant that each country would contribute towards climate action efforts to the extent that they were responsible for emissions. So, as the countries were divided into different categories, the countries which fell under the developed category, they were given a strict emission cap. Now, let's assume there is a country A, it's a developed country, and this country would be provided with an emission target or with a maximum cap on its emissions. If this developed country breaches the emission cap and if it emits excess greenhouse gases, then the developed country has to pay a price for this. But this was not much of a penalty, but instead, it was the option to buy the right to pollute more by purchasing carbon credits from other countries which were reducing their carbon footprint. So basically, this is how it would work. Now, let's say there is some other country, a country B, and let's assume this is a developing nation. So if this developing nation takes some steps to reduce its emissions, then this country would win carbon credits. For the extent of emissions reduced, it would be provided with a certified emission reduction certificate, which could be traded in carbon markets just like any other commodity or equity shares. Basically, the idea was to create a carbon market to promote carbon trading. So essentially, the polluter could continue to pollute in excess of the emission cap, but they will have to pay a price for this by encouraging emission reduction initiatives in other countries. So country A would purchase carbon credits from country B, and while actual emission reduction would happen in country B, country A would continue to emit, but in return it would be paying a price because it was acquiring the right to pollute more by purchasing these credits from countries with a lower carbon footprint. So the same concept is being implemented by China internally for its companies. Under this carbon trading scheme, China has identified a few big power business companies which will be provided with strict emission targets. When they fail to abide by these targets, they can easily purchase carbon credit from other companies which are actually investing in emission reduction technology. So this in a way indirectly encourages and incentivizes emission reduction and switch over to renewable forms of energy. And it creates a disincentive for those who continue to rely upon emissions. So China has launched this ambitious carbon trading scheme internally in order to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, as it is seeking to take a global leadership role on climate crisis, considering that China happens to be the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: India urgently needs a renewed healthcare system. Discuss. The second question: in case of a conflict between right to religion and right to life, what should prevail? Examine. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.